original, almost improvisatory quality to the piece that marked a departure from classical strictures. Meanwhile, in choosing to write the third movement as a scherzo and trio, Schumann was influenced by Beethoven, who had created this structure out of the older minuet and trio, but here, too, Schumann's composition contains further innovation. There are two trios instead of the usual one, and they are in different time signatures. The last movement of the Spring Symphony is traditional in its structure but full of a humor that seems to anticipate Tchaikovsky in his lighter moments. Toward the end, Schumann has one last surprise in store. A theme from his piano piece Kreisleriana suddenly appears in a slightly altered form. Although it is not known why he did this, such self-quotation was not unusual for Schumann. To send light into the darkness of men's hearts, such is the duty of the artist. Robert Schumann. I feel so entirely in my element with a full orchestra, even if my mortal enemies were before me, I could lead them, master them, surround them, or repulse them. Robert Schumann. New approach. Almost entirely self-taught as a composer, Schumann brought an originality and freshness to the symphony that earned him considerable acclaim. In using programmatic titles and literary references, as well as in the very sounds of the music he produced, Schumann helped to define the early Romantic ethos. The early Romantic symphony paid more attention to orchestration than the classical symphony had. It used a wider palette of orchestral timbres and combined instrumental forces in new ways. Instruments that had previously been less popular, such as the harp, tuba, and trombone, as well as a number of percussion instruments, also became standard features. Composers of this period seldom thought of themselves as markedly different from their classical forebears and were essentially trying to bring the new, Romantic, spirit of revolutionary politics to life, using quite traditional means. However, as the wider Romantic movement gained traction, some innovative composers, such as Berlioz and Liszt, experimented, not always successfully, with new approaches to harmony, rhythm, and structure. It was this spirit of experimentation that paved the way for late Romanticism. The German city of Leipzig became Schumann's home from 1828. He wrote many works at the house he shared with his wife, Clara Wieck. Situated on Inselstrasse 18, this is now a museum. Form gives way to expression. The music composed by the Romantic generation strove to reflect the importance of the individual. Taking their cue in part from Beethoven, whose Ninth Symphony had broken the mold, composers sought to create music free from well-established structures, such as the minuet and trio and the rondo, and develop other forms, such as the sonata principal and fugue. Their innovations gave the music of the Romantic composers an immediacy that enabled it to be more easily understood by middle-class audiences, who were generally untrained in music but wished to enjoy it as entertainment. In the same vein, Romantic works were often given titles to help new listeners grasp the mood and story of the music. Some musicians, such as Berlioz and Liszt, would even provide a written program to explain the intended narrative of the music to their audience. See also, Eroica, Symphonie die Sean Mullerin Symphonie Fantastique Faust Symphony. In context. Focus. 19th century sacred choral music before. 1741 Handel composes his oratorio, Messiah. 1829 Felix Mendelssohn conducts Bach's St. Matthew Passion for the first time since the composer's death in 1750. After. 1857 The Handel Festival at the Crystal Palace in London includes a performance of Messiah with a choir of 2,000 people and an orchestra of 500. Creating a vogue for very large choral performances in England. 1900 Edward Elgar composes The Dream of Gerontius, a setting of an 1866 poem by Cardinal Newman, for the Birmingham Music Festival. Choral music had started to wane in popularity by the 19th century. The classical period had heralded a new philosophy that deemed music to be at its purest when it was self-contained and referenced nothing outside itself. Instrumental music, especially the symphony, had become the most important genre. While church musicians kept the choral tradition alive to some extent, they were increasingly amateurs. Secular choirs began to flourish, but because they were not professional musicians, the prestige of choral music suffered, compared to other types of music. In the absence of a market for choral sacred music, there was also little incentive for composers to write new choral works. As a result, the choral music performed tended to draw on works from the past. Oratorios, such as Elijah, were regularly performed with huge choirs and crowd-drawing soloists at the Crystal Palace, London, and elsewhere in England during the Victorian era. An appetite for oratorios. In England, regular renditions of Handel's oratorios in the late 1700s marked the start of a trend that continued through the 19th century. Among the first works to be revived after the composer's death, they were often updated for large, grandiose performances. At later music events, such as the Three Choirs Festival, choirs could number more than 1,000 singers, a far cry from the composer's original intentions. The Berlin Singakademie was one of the first choral societies to be established, with amateurs paying a regular subscription to engage a professional conductor and defray concert expenses. It started as an educational venture for wealthy ladies, then went on to include men in 1791, and thereafter gave regular concerts. It was here that the young Felix Mendelssohn, whose father was a member of the choir, first came across the works of J. S. Bach and was inspired to conduct a performance of the Street Matthew Passion, which helped to establish the Bach revival in Germany. Further choral societies sprang up throughout Europe and America, and publishing choral music became a lucrative concern, as some choirs needed in excess of 300 copies of a vocal score for a single performance. It was almost certainly through attending performances of Handel's oratorios in London in the 1790s that Haydn was inspired to create a similar work in the classical style. The Creation, based on the Book of Genesis, was published in 1800, and curiously in a bilingual edition in both German and English, probably because Haydn had an eye on the British market, in which he was very successful. The Creation was an instant success and was performed throughout the Western world in Haydn's lifetime. Even as his other music dropped out of the standard repertoire, this oratorio remained one of the core works for choral societies and festivals. It was within this cultural climate that Mendelssohn composed his oratorio St. Paul in 1836. Its subsequent performance in Liverpool, England, and later in the US gained him a reputation as a composer who was sympathetic to the possibilities of amateurs performing his works. Mendelssohn had conducted St. Paul for the Birmingham Triennial Music Festival in 1837, and its organizers requested a new oratorio for 1846, the year before he died. The composer at first declined the invitation but was persuaded to write Elijah when told that the festival could provide as many performers as he requested. Its premiere featured an orchestra of 125 players and a chorus of 271 singers. The organizers even tried to engage the famous Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind, for whom Mendelssohn had tailored the soprano part. However, because this would have been her British debut, she declined, preferring an opera to showcase her vocal skills. Eventually, she sang the soprano role of Elijah in London in 1848. After Mendelssohn's death, in a charity concert that funded the Mendelssohn Scholarship, which still exists today. Elijah itself has a curious hybrid quality. Although clearly influenced by the Baroque and modeled on the oratorios of Bach and Handel, it still reflects the early Romantic period in its colorful orchestration and subtle lyricism. The chorales mark structural divisions in the music, as found in the Bach Passions. Also, unlike other works of the period, a surprisingly wide variety of styles and textures can be heard, which is reminiscent of Handel. However, Mendelssohn also uses innovative forms, such as including the choir and certain recitatives for dramatic effect, and he attempts to bring a sense of unity to the whole work by linking movements and using recurring motifs, both of which were musical devices of his own era. Of special interest are the fugues in the overture and finale, which clearly demonstrated to the Romantic generation that this Baroque form could be revived to great effect. Elijah was immediately successful, especially in its English version, and became a mainstay of choral concerts throughout the 19th century. Later commentators, however, often found it too conventional and considered it a product of mid-Victorian values. Felix Mendelssohn. Born into a wealthy German-Jewish family in 1809, the young Mendelssohn was a child prodigy. He excelled not only at the piano, violin, conducting, and composition but also at painting, fencing, and riding. At the age of 20, he conducted a performance of the Street Matthew Passion, the first since Bach's death. Mendelssohn's visit to England in 1829 was well received and made a great impression on him, resulting in 9 further extended trips and invitations to Buckingham Palace. As well as composing and performing, Mendelssohn conducted the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra and also founded the Leipzig Conservatoire. Following ill health, possibly due to overwork and the death of his beloved sister, he suffered a series of strokes and died in 1847, at the age of 38. Other key works: 1826 Overture, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Op. 21 1833 Symphony No. 4 in A major, Op. 90 1844 Violin Concerto in E minor, Op. 64. Never before was anything like this season. I got through more music in 2 months than in all the rest of the year. Felix Mendelssohn. Grand Sacred Works. While many composers of the period were not very interested in choral music, Hector Berlioz created 2 of the grandest choral works in the repertoire. With their extraordinarily large forces, his Requiem of 1837 and his Te Deum, first performed in 1855, are vivid examples of the excesses of high romanticism. The Requiem requires 4 off-stage brass ensembles while the score of the Te Deum specifies 12 harps. As a result, performances were, and still are, rare and impractical, and so this music had little opportunity to affect the genre. Composers such as Rossini wrote a number of cantatas, but these tended to be overshadowed by their more popular operas and are seldom heard. It was Verdi's Requiem that managed to bridge the gap between secular operatic and sacred choral works. Verdi composed it in the operatic style, with immense drama, especially in the powerful Dies Irae, and wrote parts for female voices at a time when the Catholic Church used only men in its choirs. The Requiem's first performance was at St. Mark's in Milan, but its second was at La Scala. Ever since, opinion has been divided as to whether it is a religious work or an outpouring of rather more drama than sacrament. The prophet summons the Israelites in the base recitative, "Draw near all ye people," from the oratorio Elijah. This page, handwritten by Mendelssohn, is from an original 1846 score of the work. Mendelssohn's Elijah begins with the prophet's curse on King Ahab and the Israelites. Their punishment for corrupt governance and the worship of false idols will be a terrible drought. A human requiem. Brahms's German Requiem was perhaps the most singular sacred choral work of the period. It was his first major composition and brought him international acclaim. He avoided the traditional Requiem Mass text, instead creating his own from the Lutheran Bible. There is a focus in the work on comforting the living, no reference to the Day of Judgment, and no mention of Jesus. Brahms thought of it as a human requiem, rather than belonging to any particular theological outlook, which is perhaps why it is still so frequently performed. Written in 7 large sections, the musical material is tightly organized around the opening notes, sung to Selig Sind. This creates a very unified whole, in which Brahms seems to have avoided using any previous models. A work of subtle majesty, the German Requiem stands in sharp relief to most choral music of the 19th century. Music in Victorian Britain. Between industrial innovation and empire building, the arts, especially music, were rather marginalized in early Victorian Britain. Although there was a thriving concert culture, it was predominated by foreign artists. Yet, with a rapidly expanding, wealthy middle class, there were many amateurs, young women especially, who needed socially acceptable music to play. In this climate, Songs Without Words by Mendelssohn, a respectable composer from a wealthy background, and even feted by the Queen, became ubiquitous. Meanwhile, the brass band movement in northern England and music halls in the cities were both thriving musical outlets for the working classes. Later in the century, the search for a cultural identity inspired British classical musicians, which also led to the creation of British conservatoires. Figures as diverse as Sullivan and Elgar emerged from this new, so-called, English musical renaissance. See also, Magnus Liber Organi Canticum Canticorum Monteverdi's Vespers Street Matthew Passion. Prince Albert plays the organ for Mendelssohn as Queen Victoria looks on. The composer enjoyed several visits to Buckingham Palace in 1842. In context. Focus Italian opera. Before 1829, Rossini shocks the musical world by retiring from opera after his final stage work, William Tell, premieres in Paris. 1848, composer Gaetano Donizetti dies, 13 years after his compatriot Vincenzo Bellini, leaving Verdi as the leading light of Italian opera. After 1887, Milan hosts the premiere of Verdi's Otello, his first opera since Aida in 1871. 1890, Italian composer Pietro Mascagni's masterpiece Cavalleria Rusticana premieres in Rome and ushers in the naturalistic, melodramatic, verismo style of opera. It was usual in the first decades of the 19th century for Italian opera to be concerned with the tragedies of the great and noble. Giuseppe Verdi challenged this and produced operas about ordinary people as well. Verdi enjoyed notable early successes, such as Nabucco, based on the biblical story of Nebuchadnezzar II. Its chorus, Vie Pensiero, in which the Hebrew slaves lament the loss of their homeland, would later become an anthem for Italian independence. However, it wasn't until well into Verdi's creative life that he fulfilled his democratic ambitions with three masterpieces composed in quick succession: Rigoletto, Illinois Trovatore, and La Traviata. Rigoletto focuses on the eponymous character, a hunchback who, in trying to protect his daughter, unwittingly brings about her undoing. Il Trovatore tells the melodramatic tale of the beautiful Leonora who is caught between two men and a gypsy woman's vengeance. And in La Traviata, a courtesan named Violetta sacrifices her love and, ultimately, herself, for the sake of the patriarchal society that seeks to control her. These three operas confirmed Verdi's breakaway from what he described as his galley years, time spent producing works to order for the opera industry. Italian tenor Francesco Melli performs as Violetta's lover, Alfredo, in the Brindisi drinking song in a 2016 production of La Traviata. His love for Violetta brings shame upon his family. Bending the rules. Verdi managed to manipulate and subvert operatic conventions to achieve a synthesis of tradition and innovation. With La Traviata, he took a subject drawn from a well-known novel, La Dame aux Camélias by Alexandre Dumas, and in a step unprecedented then, set the drama at the time of composition. Ultimately, the portrayal of a fallen woman in modern society was rejected as too risque by the Italian censors, so the opera was set in the 1700s for the premiere. La Traviata was nonetheless unique as it boldly confronted society's hypocritical treatment of women. Although some of La Traviata's most famous numbers, especially the Brindisi drinking song in Act 1, feature crowd scenes, La Traviata is an opera remarkable for its moments of intimacy. Verdi draws us into the world of his heroine, and this groundbreaking focus on a female protagonist paved the way for others, such as the gypsy heroine of Georges Bizet's Carmen, a character from French opera, who is similarly drawn from the literary world and similarly exposed the hypocrisy of 19th-century sexual mores. Final masterpieces. Verdi's many subsequent works saw the composer tackle the different conventions of grand opera in such masterpieces as Don Carlos, composed for the Paris Opera in 1867. However, Aida, written for the opening of the new opera house in Cairo in 1871, marked a break for Verdi, who was unhappy with the importation of French and German opera to Italy. Verdi began to focus on other aspects of his life and composed little after the Missa de Requiem of 1874, written in memory of the nationalist poet, Alessandro Manzoni, until his final two pieces, which were both based on works by his beloved Shakespeare, Othello and Falstaff. To copy the truth can be a good thing, but to invent the truth is better, much better. Giuseppe Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi was born in Busseto, northern Italy, in 1813. His father, an innkeeper of modest social standing, encouraged his son's early education, and a wealthy merchant in the town, Antonio Barezzi, paid for the young Verdi to study in Milan. In 1836, Verdi married Barezzi's daughter, but both she and their two young children died 4 years later. In spite of this tragedy, Verdi's career began to take off. His breakthrough came with Nabucco in 1841. Over the following decade, he produced 13 operas. The 1850s saw him become the most successful opera composer of his day, and from the 1850s his music was embraced by the nationalist Risorgimento movement. In 1859, Verdi married the operatic soprano Giuseppina Strapponi, staying with her until her death in 1897. Verdi himself died 4 years later, in 1901. Other key works: 1842 Nabucco, 1867 Don Carlos, 1874 Missa de Requiem, 1887 Otello. See also, The Magic Flute, The Barber of Seville, De Freischutz Tosca, The Wreckers, Peter Grimes. In context. Focus. The Faust legend and German Romanticism before 1830. The premiere of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, with the young Liszt in the Paris audience, sees the debut of the Romantic Symphony Orchestra, much more colorful than those that came before. 1846. Berlioz conducts the first performances of The Damnation of Faust, based on Goethe's Faust Part 1. After 1861, Liszt arranges a piano version of his Mephisto Waltz No. 1, which was originally written for orchestra. 1906, Mahler composes his Eighth Symphony. Its main movement is a huge setting of the closing, Chorus Mysticus, scene of Goethe's Faust Part 2. The central myths of European art can often be traced back to sources thousands of years old. Unusually, the Faust legend is a more recent phenomenon, based on a real person. The original Johann Faustus was a late 15th century magician-illusionist, who claimed to be in league with the devil. His dubious career traveling through the southeast German region of Thuringia even secured him a doctorate from Heidelberg University. The Faust story had already become part of folklore when the literary doyen of the German Romantic movement, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, began to explore the character in the 1770s. Mephistopheles holds a mirror up to Faust in a poster created by Richard Roland Holst for a 1918 Dutch National Theatre production of Goethe's play. Powerful appeal. Romanticism had multiple roots in the political and social upheavals of its time. With industrialism came the rise of a middle class less beholden to the church and the aristocracy, and in this more liberated climate, Goethe's verse play Faust developed a potent appeal. Faust concerns the corruption of a secular, rational mind. Goethe's hero is a brilliant agnostic philosopher, whose intellectual disillusionment leads him to be waylaid by the demon Mephistopheles' offer of a world of sensual and sexual satisfaction. In the poem's first part, Faust is introduced to the trusting young Gretchen, whom he seduces, impregnates, and abandons to madness and death. The second part finds the remorseful Faust applying his powers to the cause of human good. As Faust's death approaches, Gretchen's soul intercedes for him, and angels carry Faust aloft to a higher world. The legend was taken up in Charles Gounod's grand opera Faust, Robert Schumann's oratorio Scenes from Goethe's Faust, and by Wagner in his Faust Overture. The most significant musical version, however, is the one by Hungarian virtuoso Franz Liszt. Liszt's Faust. The young Liszt was introduced to Faust Part 1 by his friend Berlioz. Enthralled, he sketched out some ideas first for an opera, then a symphony, but the idea remained on hold until he had settled in Goethe's adopted hometown of Weimar. In 1854, over a period of 2 months, he composed and orchestrated the first 3 movements of his Faust Symphony. Dedicating the work to Berlioz, he added the finale, with its tenor soloist and male voice choir, for the first performance 3 years later. Rather than following Goethe's complex narrative, each of the symphony's first 3 movements presents a portrait of one of the main characters. The long first movement portrays the multiple layers of Faust's restless nature in a complex, chromatic musical language. While Gretchen's movement is Faust's opposite in its sweet winsomeness, Mephistopheles has a diabolic scherzo, in which each theme is a distortion of one already used to portray Faust. The finale is a radiant choral setting of the poem's concluding chorus mysticus, as Gretchen's theme leads Faust's soul, much like in Goethe's version, into a transfigured musical world. A frontispiece of sheet music for Liszt's Faust Symphony, published in Leipzig, Germany, lists the main characters of the symphony and the type of orchestral arrangement. Franz Liszt. Born in Rating, Eastern Austria, in 1811, Liszt showed early talent as a pianist. He studied in Vienna, where he played to an amazed Beethoven, and his subsequent teenage years in Paris consolidated his standing as the supreme pianist of his time. At 24 years old, he eloped to Switzerland with Countess Marie Diegold. Later, in Italy, they had 3 children but drifted apart as Liszt pursued a relentless concert schedule throughout Europe. In 1848, Liszt moved with the Ukrainian princess Caroline Sayn-Wittgenstein to Weimar, where he composed principal works of the Romantic era. Later, he took minor Catholic orders in Rome. In 1886, Liszt died of pneumonia in Bayreuth, Germany. Other key works: 1842 Annie's de Pèlerinage, 1853 Piano Sonata in B minor, 1856 Dante's Symphony, 1868 Christus. See also, Stamitz Symphony in E-flat major, Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, Eroica, Symphonie Fantastique, Schumann's Symphony No. 1, Brahms's Symphony No. 1. In context. Focus. 19th century waltz music before. 1819 Carl Maria von Weber's Invitation to the Dance is the first waltz written for concert performance rather than dancing. 1823 Schubert writes Valses Sentimentals, a collection of 34 waltzes for solo piano. 1834 Chopin's Grande Valse Brillante is the first of his solo piano waltzes to be published. After 1877 Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake is one of many late 19th century ballets and operas that feature waltzes. 1911 Maurice Ravel publishes a suite of waltzes, Valses Nobles et Sentimentals. 1919 Ravel composes La Valse, about the rise and fall of the waltz as a musical genre. One of the most instantly recognizable waltzes ever written, and Der Schönen, Blauen Donau, was first performed in Vienna in February 1867 as a choral piece, conducted by its Austrian composer, Johann Strauss II. Comprising 5 interlinked waltz themes, it was designed to lift the spirit of the Austrian nation after its defeat by Prussia in the 7 Weeks' War. It was, however, the purely orchestral version, premiered in Paris later that year, that took off. The lilting beauty of Strauss's melodies made the piece beloved the world over. Waltzes have their roots in the country dances of southern Germany, Bohemia, and Austria. From the mid-1700s, more refined versions, with a distinctive triple beat, started to become popular in Europe's ballrooms. Couples held one another face to face as they twirled around the floor, in contrast to the stately minuets and other French-style court dances that the waltz was starting to replace. By the early 1800s, the waltz had spread throughout Europe, with Vienna as its capital. Invigorated first by Johann Strauss I, then his son, it became the signature dance of the 19th century. A statue of the Waltz King, playing the violin, stands in Stadtpark, Vienna. As a child, Strauss practiced the violin secretly, as his musician father wanted him to become a banker. See also, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Water Music Symphonie Fantastique, The Nutcracker. In context. Focus. 19th century solo concertos before. 1830 Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor is premiered in Warsaw, Poland. 1836 Clara Schumann writes her piano concerto in A minor, 9 years before her husband, Robert Schumann, writes his piano concerto in A minor. 1849 Liszt completes the final version of his piano concerto No. 1 in E-flat major. After 1868 Grieg composes one of the most popular piano concertos ever written, his piano concerto in A minor. 1881 Johannes Brahms completes his piano concerto No. 2 in B-flat major. The French composer Camille Saint-Saëns' piano concerto No. 2 premiered in Paris in May 1868. It had taken him 17 days of flat-out labor to finish it in time for the concert, which his friend, the Russian musician Anton Rubinstein, conducted. Saint-Saëns played the solo part. Exploring the form. Solo concertos had evolved over the course of the 19th century. Dazzling displays by virtuoso performer composers, notably violinist Paganini and pianist Chopin and Liszt, dominated the years after 1810, with the orchestra providing little more than a backdrop. Later figures, such as Robert Schumann, called for a better balance. Most major composers of the time, including Mendelssohn, Brahms, Grieg, and Dvorak, wrote concertos and experimented widely with the form. In his piano concerto No. 2, Saint-Saëns ignored convention by opening not with the orchestra but with a solo piano prelude in the style of Bach, and he replaced the usual fast-slow-fast sequence of movements with a slow-fast-faster progression, giving rise to the quip that it begins with Bach and ends with Offenbach. Lack of rehearsal time resulted in a disappointing premiere, but the concerto won admirers and remains a staple of the concert repertoire. Saint-Saëns wrote another 3 concertos for the piano, 3 for the violin, and 2 for the cello. He who does not get absolute pleasure from a simple series of well-constructed chords, beautiful only in their arrangement, is not really fond of music. Camille Saint-Saëns. See also, Pieces de Clavecin Scarlatti's Sonata in D minor, K.9, Pastorale, Clementi's Piano Sonata in F-sharp minor. In context. Focus. Complete artwork before 1821 Weber's Der Freischütz, considered to be the first German romantic opera, premieres in Berlin. 1824 Beethoven completes his 9th symphony. In a form that was traditionally wordless, Beethoven's use of words in the symphony's finale greatly influenced Wagner. 1849 After being forced into exile, Wagner begins a series of essays setting out a plan for reforming opera. The first step later becomes The Ring. 1862 Wagner conducts Beethoven's 9th Symphony in Bayreuth to celebrate the laying of the cornerstone of the Festspielhaus. After 1883 Wagner's widow Cosima takes over the running of the Bayreuth Festival, exercising iron control until her death in 1930. 1933 Hitler comes to power in Germany and, as an ardent Wagnerian, involves himself intimately with the running of the festival. 1976 Bayreuth's centenary staging of The Ring, later widely televised, presents the work as a critique of 19th-century industrialization. Two things changed beyond recognition in Wagner's lifetime: German opera and Germany itself. The country that he grew up in was little more than a group of loosely linked principalities and kingdoms, while German opera before Wagner was fighting a losing battle against imports from France and Italy, apart from a few notable exceptions. Beethoven's Fidelio, Mozart's Don Giovanni, and the romantic operas of Carl Maria von Weber represented the only resistance against the prevailing taste for foreign operatic imports, often poorly performed in the various court theaters that were dotted around Germany. By the time of Wagner's death in 1883, Germany was a nation-state. German opera, or, more correctly, Wagnerian opera, had conquered France, Italy, and beyond. Other composers rushed to emulate his harmonic adventurousness and his richly symphonic style, and longed for even a fraction of the quasi-religious devotion that Wagner's vast musical dramas inspired. The Valkyrie Brunhilde meets the lovers Siegmund and Sieglinde to warn Siegmund of his imminent death. This scene from Wagner's Die Walküre was painted by Gaston Bussière. The Road to Revolution. More than any other composer before him, Wagner's own life and art were intertwined with the developments, political, historical, and philosophical, of the world around him. From an early age, he was fascinated with how to combine drama and music, and increasingly, with how a new sort of opera could help revitalize the art form in Germany, as well as inspire and unite the country itself. He was unusual among opera composers in that he always wrote his own librettos and did so even in his early operas. His first opera, Die Feen, delved deep into Romanticism, while his second, Das Liebesverbot, loosely based on Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, was closer to Italian comic opera. A largely unsuccessful period in Paris in the late 1830s exposed the young composer to the bel canto of Vincenzo Bellini as well as to grand opera, a local genre whose extravagant scenic features would broaden his theatrical horizons. The German-born composer Giacomo Meyerbeer was among the most successful exponents of this type of operatic spectacle. Wagner's next work, Rienzi, was modeled closely on Meyerbeer's style and proved to be his first breakthrough, leading to Wagner's appointment as Kapellmeister at the Dresden Court Theatre. Wagner's subsequent works in the 1840s, Der Fliegende Holländer, Tannhäuser, and Lohengrin, are the earliest operas included in the canon of works performed at the festival that Wagner founded at Bayreuth. They showed the composer increasingly breaking down the traditional structures of opera, blurring the lines between individual arias, duets, and choruses, and focusing on the psychological development of characters of unprecedented complexity. The operas addressed subjects that would concern him for the rest of his creative life: redemption, the nature of desire, and, in Tannhäuser, how religion can and should temper this desire. Theory and practice. Wagner's involvement in the uprising in Dresden in 1849, part of a series of Republican revolts that swept through Germany and other parts of Europe, led to a warrant being issued for his arrest, forcing him into exile in Switzerland. During the first 5 years in exile, he did not compose a single note of music, concentrating instead on setting out the foundations for his operatic reforms in a series of long essays. It was during this period that Wagner came up with the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which would combine all the elements of stage performance in one. His new works would amalgamate the genius of Beethoven and Shakespeare and be modeled on ancient Greek drama, which, as far as Wagner understood it, not only combined all the arts but did so in a way that was essential for uniting a population. Wagner sought to create an artistic experience with religious, social, and ethical aspects. Such an artwork would gain yet further resonance with its audience, he argued, by being based on subjects rooted deep in their unconscious, ideally myth. In his new music dramas, as his works became known, he would be able to harness the power of music to explore the inner workings of his characters. Unlike with the predominant forms of opera, in which musical concerns and, in the worst cases, the vanity of singers, were primary considerations, here it would be the drama that would define the form of the music. With one bound I became a revolutionist, and acquired the conviction that every decently active being ought to occupy himself with politics exclusively. Richard Wagner. Wagner was born in Leipzig in 1813 and was drawn to the theater at an early age, also developing an obsession with music, particularly Beethoven. His early years were dominated by instability, exacerbated by his irresponsible attitude toward money. His operas began to see success in the 1840s, and a job as Kapellmeister in Dresden followed, but both were jeopardized by his political activism. Forced into exile in Switzerland in the 1850s, he set about a wholesale reform of opera, first in theoretical essays, then in practice, most ambitiously in the Ring. In the 1860s, his fortunes improved thanks to the financial aid of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, which gave him new artistic freedom. Wagner died in Venice in 1883, the year after Parsifal premiered in Bayreuth. Composing the World. The work that came closest to this aim was a cycle of operas, Der Ring der Nibelungen, based on a mixture of Norse and Germanic mythology. It was not initially conceived as a tetralogy, but Wagner's inability to progress with the subject as a single opera, originally called Siegfried's Tod, led to him expanding it backward, adding more and more prehistory in each additional work. This process also necessitated the development of leitmotif, a technique latent in his works of the 1840s but raised in the Ring to a level of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. This method allowed Wagner to weave together continuous acts over large spans but also meant that the orchestra could begin to offer commentary on the action, much as the chorus had done in ancient Greek drama. Wagner finally completed his text for the cycle by 1852, and he began composing the music shortly afterward, without any realistic prospect of the works ever being performed.